Hi everyone, so my name is Rachel O'Connor and I'll be discussing sterilization and eugenics in the United States and utilizing German transitional justice methods. And I'm saying German transitional methods as in like post-Holocaust methods. So just to give definition on eugenics, well, an idea of eugenics. Eugenics is what happens when genetics is linked to traits that society deems as not good, or as on the slide it says less than. This becomes an issue, especially when there's the problem of, well, in the research that I've read, things like moron, feeble-mindedness, criminality. These were all terms, and they were seen as traits and believed to be genetic. So victims of this, you had most of them were going to be women, poor women, disabled women, and women of color. And so this is going to be important because I'm going to focus mostly on women of color, specifically my cases look at women of Spanish descent, mostly part of the Latinx community. So we're going to be looking at, as our model of what transitional justice can look like, we're going to look at post-Holocaust, but to talk a little bit about the Holocaust. Millions of European Jews were killed, as well as other minority groups, to the point that 2/3 of all European Jews were murdered. And so one of the methods used in the Holocaust was sterilization. And that is removing the ability for people to make their own reproductive choices when used in eugenics, because society and panels of doctors make the decision rather than the person making the decision on whether or not they want to be sterilized. The thing is, the important thing that we're going to discuss is that these sterilization and the concept of eugenics was borrowed from the United States. And Goring, one of the Nazi doctors, talked about how he didn't see it as a problem, and he had gotten this information from the US, that it was the state's right to choose what citizens could and could not reproduce. And that's going to be important for this concept of eugenics and sterilization, because states see it as their decision, what's best for society as a whole. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of eugenics in the United States. So to begin this, we're going to start with Buck versus Bell. So that was a 1927 Supreme Court case. And so Carrie Buck was going to be sterilized, and eugenics boards were boards of doctors that made the decision on whether or not a person was going to be sterilized by looking over, because their name could be turned in by a doctor, police officer, a social worker. Pretty much anyone could fill out this paperwork if you worked for social welfare. And the eugenics board would look over this and decide if you were a candidate for sterilization. And so she was 17 years old, and she did not want to be sterilized, but the Supreme Court says that the state would be allowed to sterilize her because the eugenics board had made the decision that she was someone that was feeble-minded. And Carrie Buck was from a poor area. So her parents didn't have money. She had a lot of siblings. And so the issue of like poverty was seen as genetic. It was, so she would always be in poverty and her kids would as well. It wasn't seen as like structural issues. They were seen as genetic issues. And so the thing is that Buck versus Bell hasn't been overruled to today. And well, as of, yeah. And in 2004, there were still 7 states that allowed for forced sterilization. So eugenics boards, if the state decided to, could make the decision if someone could be sterilized. So we're going to look at cases of eugenics in the United States. And so one of them that we're going to talk about is Puerto Rico. And so when the U.S. came into control of Puerto Rico, they saw it as a like low GDP economy. And so they kind of put it as sterilization as poverty control. So if women were sterilized, they weren't having kids, they could work, but they were cheaper labor than men. And so the United States put this as like an boosting Puerto Rico's economy, and by extension the US, because the US had control of Puerto Rico. And so because of this, by 1965, over a third of women were sterilized. And they were, postpartum sterilization was pretty common. So right after you have a baby, like while the delivery is going on, that's when it would occur. And a lot of women weren't told that this was going to happen to them. And so the other thing on this is that if we're looking at reproductive rights in Puerto Rico, a lot of women were made to have, they were like the guinea pigs for birth control testing. So to make sure birth control was safe for women on continental US. So this was taking women from poor neighborhoods in Puerto Rico, and specifically these were women of color, because it's taking that dehumanizing aspect and using them to testings for white women that had the ability to pay for birth control in the States. So our next thing that we're going to look at is that there's California, where this is more current. And so Latinx women in hospitals were racially profiled and forcibly sterilized. So this was either done without them being told, or hospital staff would push them to do this by threatening to have them deported or threatening to not provide pain medication for labor. That many of these women, they were sterilized while they were going through labor with one child. Madrigal versus Quilligan mentioned this, but even people that were not part of that lawsuit mentioned that they were targeted after they were heard speaking Spanish. And so they believe that part of it was the fact that either some of the women didn't speak English at all, some of them would speak English to their doctors, but hospital staff would hear them speaking Spanish to the rest of their family members. And Madrigal versus Quilligan, the doctors had mentioned sterilizing women forcibly to prevent more children from needing welfare. And the result of this involved, one, it made a requirement for translators to be available at hospitals, and it reinforced written consent for procedures. So one of the reasons why I decided to do this is because just this year, The Guardian was discussing how ICE was sterilizing undocumented migrants in detention centers within Georgia. And in that situation, similar to previous ones, especially in California, the people that have done interviews with said women that were sterilized, women mentioned that no one gave them a straight answer. They weren't given heads up before time. Consent was never asked for. And many times they weren't given even post-surgical care. And so just their general welfare wasn't taken care of. But this concept of forcing sterilization is still echoes the previous things, the previous cases that we talked about, where it was seen as children were being pushed onto our economic system, and we targeted people of color because they're dehumanized. So the transitional justice methods that we can take from the Holocaust would be reparations. So giving money to victims and their families. Unfortunately, because of sterilization, they don't have children after that. So reparations cannot be given to any future children. But another part that we could look into is allowing for guaranteed payment for reversal surgeries when those come out and are safe and available. So having women, if they decide that they want to have their surgery reversed in the future, the US and the government can pay for that to happen and allow them to have their choice back. Education is very important, and that's tied into truth commissions. So education is like, I got some of this information from the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and they have online resources. So that in itself is education, as long as the physical museum itself allows for it. And it's also meant as like preventing these issues from going on and preventing denialism of what has happened to these women. Truth commissions are important because you can tie this also into the Nuremberg trials, where they were trying to get down and to what had happened during the Holocaust, and included Nazi doctors being tried and imprisoned for what happened, truth commissions, and just information gathering in general. Unfortunately, the only state to have made a decision and to have gone through the process of looking into what happened is North Carolina. And that was a 2-year process where they had teams of historians going in and trying to see if there were people still alive, information they could get, because North Carolina, after the Holocaust, while many states started moving away from it, North Carolina saw an increase in the number of sterilizations that were just going on. So historians looked into that. And so North Carolina has the largest archives of what has happened in sterilization and eugenics in our history. And so when a lot of research is done on eugenics in the US, they look at North Carolina archives. And so then also leading into this is preventative programs. So using the education, using truth commissions and information gathering about these can create things like the Holocaust Memorial Museum. Well, we can do the similar things with the targeting of minorities through sterilization and eugenics. And so here's my bibliography. And thank you.